I'll just get this organized. So just before we get started today, I just want to find out a little bit about you before I start talking. And you have to listen to me for the next hour. So hands up if you are a classroom teacher here today. Any grade. Okay. How about a special education teacher? Paraeducator? Okay. How about an administrator? Community support service, like OT, advocate, physical therapist. Okay, parent. Do we have any parents here today? Okay. How about, do any of you have any children? Anybody in the room have kids? Okay, good, good, good. Does anybody in the room have pets? Yeah. Does anybody in the room have pets that they treat like kids? Yeah, especially those cats, right? Yes, I know. Oh, this is going to do it to me again. My son moved back home after 4 years at university. He moved back home to study for his medical school entrance exam, and he brought back 2 cats with him, which we did not want at all because we had already had a dog, and you know, our lives were busy enough, and we were not cat people. Like, how many people say that, right? Like, I am not a cat person. I'm not ever going to have a cat. Anyway, these 2 cats showed up, and yeah, needless to say, we dress them up. We take pictures of them. They have Instagram accounts. It's really bad. So today we're looking at practical strategies to modify your curriculum. I'm Nicole Eredics, and I was thrilled to present here last year. Was anybody in my session last year, or are you all new? Good, I can repeat the same presentation. So I was here last year talking about this, and this topic arose out of a book that I wrote several years ago now, which stems from my experiences as an inclusion teacher in a fully inclusive district in British Columbia, Canada, which provincially is a fully inclusive system. So the information that I give you today, the stories, the tips, the strategies, they are all teacher tested. They're all things that I've done and I've used in my classrooms, and I'm thrilled to be able to share them with you because when I moved down here about 10 years ago with my husband and my 2 kids, I fully intended on continuing my teaching career, and that was until I went to my daughter's school and noticed that they were struggling with inclusion, to say the least. So I kind of felt, you know what, maybe I'm meant to be doing something else, and that just kind of led into me, you know, starting a blog. I don't know if anybody's heard of the Inclusive Class blog, but that's me. I do that, and then I'm also on Twitter under the Inclusive Class. So if you are interested in tech, connecting over technology and online media, I'm on Twitter and Facebook, and I've got my blog, and it's all under the Inclusive Class. And so that's where I share a lot of my information. So. And I'm thrilled that you're here. Thank you. It's towards the end of the day, and you know, sometimes it's just hard to, when you've had an early morning, to keep going to the very end. So I'm really happy that you're here. And I just wanted to, I think I've already gone over this. I've got my website address up here, and also that resource that I have for you, the inclusion binder. And in it, you'll see some of the graphics that I used today and some of the content and resources that I used today, and as well as parts of this presentation. So, and I don't know why this keeps moving forward, but hopefully it'll behave. So, earlier I was asking you, what what job you do, where you're from. Well, I haven't asked you where you're from, but if you have kids, if you have pets, all that kind of stuff. And just to try and get a sense of who's here. So I just want to quickly share something about me that's related to this topic. And that is my family and I, one of our favorite things to do when I'm not doing this and working is we love to go to concerts together. And not just the school Christmas concert kind, but we love to go to all kinds of different concerts, whether it's, you know, pop, country, heavy metal, whatever. That's kind of our favorite pastime. And one day, a couple years ago, one of my good friends came to me and said, hey, I've got these 2 tickets to this concert, and I know you love the band. They're your favorite band. They're from Ireland, if anybody wants to guess who they are. They happen to be box seat tickets. Would you like to go? And I'm like, sign me up, I'm going. So, however, we only had 2 tickets, so it was just my husband and I that day. This is a picture from another concert that we went to. And so had these tickets, box seat tickets. We were just thrilled, couldn't wait. The day of the concert came, we went down to the venue and went in, started to look around for our seats. Now, if you know anything about box seats, they're typically the seats that are right up near the stage. You've got like a primo view of what's happening. You can, you know, pretty much feel like the bass. I mean, you're right there. You can see the musicians sweat. I mean, it's all there, right in front of you. And so we were excited. So we walk in and we ask the attendant, you know, where are our seats? We're looking for our box seats. And he said, well, ma'am, you realize that you're in a hockey arena. That's, you know, in the winter it's used as a hockey arena, right? And I said, well, yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, you've got the stands and, you know, the floor and the stage. And he said, well, the box seats in a arena are typically not on the floor and down near the stage. They're way up at the top where you can sit and look down on what's happening. And I thought, that's why my friend wanted to give me those tickets. Because the box seats that we ended up in were way at the back of the arena. I mean, we needed binoculars to see the musicians. It was the least concert experience I'd ever been to in my life. And it was so bad. I mean, I was grateful, but honestly, yeah, it just was not the concert experience that I was expecting, to say the least. And so that was kind of my experience with this concert that I went to. And the reason I'm telling you this is because here I was fully anticipating this super exciting moment in my life. And I was going to go and do something that I really love doing, and, you know, being around people who love the same thing as I do. And it reminds me of certain kids in our school system who are wanting to be at school, who are wanting to join in, who are wanting to be with their friends, but they're having a very limited experience doing so. And those are our kids who have various disabilities, who are educated in various settings that are not directly with their peers. They are the ones that are kind of experiencing education on the periphery, much like we experienced our concert at the other end of the arena in a box seat. So that's what I'm talking about today, is these kids and how we can engage them more in our education system, and what techniques and strategies we can use to do that. And of course, as the title suggests, the major strategy that we can use is by modifying curriculum. And that is really the ultimate goal to, or the ultimate solution to providing a really inclusive experience for our kids. So, once again, here we go. Oh, there we go. So, in our school system right now, there are about 6.5 million students with disabilities, and almost half of them are excluded from the classroom more than 80% of the day. So almost half of them are being educated in separate classrooms, separate buildings, and sometimes separate schools. And that is despite a legal mandate that says, or sorry, I'm just going to backtrack. Most of the students who are left out of the classrooms for that amount of time are students with multiple and intellectual disabilities. So those are our kids that are working at different levels and ability levels than what their peers are working at. So they're typically not at the same developmental level. This is happening despite the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that mandates that students with disabilities receive an education that has elements of equity, accountability, and excellence for our students with disabilities. Now, the word inclusion isn't specifically used in that mandate. However, the words least restrictive environment or the least restrictive environment possible is used, and it is common knowledge and known amongst professionals that that environment is a general education classroom. So now the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act also goes on to state that the way we educate our students and the way we welcome them into our schools is to have high expectations for them and to ensure their access to the general education curriculum to the greatest extent possible. So we really are trying to make this experience for our kids, not just because it's the right thing to do. We know it's good for kids. There's 30 years of research that tells us that inclusion is best for kids, but there's also a legal mandate that says we need to be bringing our children with disabilities into our general education classrooms. And that's because we cannot predict what another person will learn in the future. So we are not the ones to judge or to say what our students are going to be capable of learning or what they will learn down the road. So we want to provide them with the most and maximum amount of experiences as possible. And that includes not just, going to music class, not just going to art class, not just going to, PE class, but that means staying in the classroom, the general education classroom, and experiencing the curriculum and learning from the curriculum as his or her same age peers. Now, I just want to move on before I start talking specifically about modifying curriculum. I just want to ensure that we all know the differences between what a modified curriculum looks like and what it means to make accommodations to the curriculum. Hands up if you think you already have a good idea of what the difference between accommodations and modifications is. Okay. Hands up if you okay. And not at all. Okay, so we're good. So we'll just do a quick review. So accommodations and modifications are born out of the fact that we are taking a system and we are adjusting it and creating it for students of various abilities so that they can achieve. And Diane Rickler, who's past president of Inclusion International, she actually kind of alludes to this and kind of sums up the purpose of accommodations and modifications in her statement that says, inclusion is not a strategy to help people fit into systems and structures which exist in our societies. It is about transforming those systems and structures to make it better for everyone. And inclusion is about creating a better world for everyone. So we're transforming our curriculum, we're transforming our classrooms, we're transforming our schools to create better environments and more enriching environments for our students with disabilities and with learning issues too. This applies to children across the board. I mean, today we're specifically talking about students on modified programs who typically have intellectual disabilities and multiple disabilities, but we're also talking about students who have experienced trauma, have anxiety, have learning disabilities. Those are all students that also require some form of accommodation to their learning experience. Now, looking at more closely at the classroom and the curriculum and what's happening when we're teaching our classes, because we all know even if we don't have a student who's specifically identified as having a disability in our classroom. We all know that there's such a wide range of kids in our classroom that we do have to accommodate for and that we do have to make sure are accessing the curriculum. And when that happens, well, you know, in any situation, regardless of what kind of class you have, one of the best approach to sort of reaching and teaching most of those kids is through universal design for learning. And I know that that's a big theme this year at this conference, and you've probably heard people talk about it before. But typically, an approach such as universal design for learning will reach most of the kids in your class through varied instruction. Now, when a child needs more time with the curriculum, you know, they understand it, but they just need a little bit more practice with it, then we provide them with small groups, intervention, resource time. We want to be able to give them just that little bit of extra time to practice and use the information. However, when a child is having trouble accessing the curriculum, so they understand it, but they're having trouble accessing it, that's when we use accommodations. So this is where I'm going to start to talk about the differences, the specific differences between accommodations and modifications. So we start to provide ways for students to access the material. I'm just going to quickly pass that. So a curriculum accommodations are for kids who understand the material that you're teaching, but need help getting to it. So that might mean a child who, for example, something as simple as being able to see the board. They might need eyeglasses to see the board. They might need to sit closer to the board. A student with a hearing issue might need to be sitting closer to the teacher. A student who's easily distracted might need to be sitting away from a window. That's when we employ accommodations for those students who can understand what they're learning, but they just need that extra support getting there. Curriculum accommodations make curriculum accessible. I'm just going to sum up a few main points of curriculum accommodations. They are for students who are working at grade level, and we do use accommodations for students who are not working at grade level as well, but there can be students who only need accommodations and not modifications. With curriculum accommodations, there are no substitutions, deletions, or additions to the curriculum. So the curriculum does not change. Oops. Curriculum accommodations, they do not fundamentally change the curriculum. So whatever you're teaching to the class stays the same for what you're teaching to the student who requires the accommodations. And the accommodations do not alter the learning outcomes. So the goals remain the same for that student as they do for the rest of the class. And as a result, grading and credit is the same. So a student who is receiving accommodations is receiving the same content, the same expectations, the same learning outcomes, and the same grading and credit. And often, well, I would say most of the time, the students' accommodations are recorded in a 504 plan, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And that is a legal document that outlines ways in which the students will receive the accommodations. So just very quickly, some examples of accommodations, just to ensure that you know what an accommodation is. Accommodations can be made through changes to the setting in the classroom. And I believe these slides are on the presentation that I uploaded to the website for this conference. So if you want to go back and have a look at the different ideas and ways for accommodations, you can check it out online. But very quickly, you can provide a different setting for students. You can dim lights. You can give them alternate spaces, draw the blinds. I mean, a very common practice that I did when I was teaching is right after lunchtime, I would bring the kids in after lunchtime and typically have the lights down, the blinds closed, just kind of like a calming environment so that they can settle in and then transition into learning. So it was about, 2 to 3 minutes of just this kind of like quiet room, which helped kids move into the next stage of their learning. We can also make accommodations for students in terms of how we have them respond to work. So we can give them extra time. We can give them graphic organizers. We can give them, access to a scribe. Right now, my daughter is in university, and she is getting one of those live scribe pens for her lectures. Have you seen those? They're amazing. So she has access to one of those, and she can write it out on this notepad, and at the same time, it records the instructor. And then she can go back later on that night and, she puts her pen on a word, and then the instructor's voice pops up. So she has like all these ways of taking in this information with this live scribe. And you can also use, word banks to help support kids. And then, of course, accommodations can be made to, sorry, this isn't working properly. Time. So as I mentioned earlier, we can have extended testing time, reduced workload, untimed tests, pacing, taking the tests at different times. Actually, I'll just quickly tell you about my daughter again. Because she's she has accommodations at university, her French instructor had a midterm that he was giving the class, and so one of her accommodations is to write the test in a different room at the Accessibility Center and write it at a different time than what the rest of the kids are writing it at, so that she has more time. Well, she went in to write her exam last week, and the professor gave her the wrong midterm. He gave her the midterm for the class that was in the next level above. And she was just, she was so upset when she came out, and she said, Mom, I didn't know anything. And of course, I was like, did you study? You've been too busy out with your friends, blah, if you fail out of university, you're coming home. There's all this stuff, right? I'm like being like the mom that, is all anxious about it. Just over this one little midterm that's in her first semester of university. And anyways, so she was just panicking, and she emailed the instructor, and the instructor was like, oh, yeah, I think I gave you the wrong midterm. And so he said, if you do well enough on it, we can use it, and I'll give you extra credit for it. And so you know what she did? She did well on it, and so she got extra credit for it. So surprisingly, it worked out in her favor. So yeah, poor thing though. She was just beside herself. She's like, I studied so hard, and then I ended up with this test that, was not meant for her, but she pulled through. It worked out in her favor in the end. So yeah, if you're giving alternate tests at different times of the day, make sure they're the right tests that you're giving your students. And these are just various tools that we can use for making accommodations for kids. We can use, highlighted rulers, the little pencil grips, specially lined paper. Visual supports are so essential. Highlighters. I mean, hands up if you use any of these in your classrooms with your students. Yeah, very common. I mean, I use them for myself. I mean, I have all sorts of little aids and knickknacks on my desk that I like to use and help me with my work. So then just a final kind of note on accommodations, and just a visual reminder, a graphic for you that I like to tell people is that you can think of accommodations as smooth pathways to learning. So they smooth out what might ordinarily be a bumpy road and help children access learning on these smooth pathways. So let's move on to modifications, which is what we're here for. So we've got our universal design for learning to help reach most kids. We've got intervention that will also support our kids. We can make accommodations for our kids, but what about those kids who are not yet working at grade level? And I use the word yet because I never like to place a limit on a student and say they're not working at grade level. In the district that I worked in, when we did our report cards, we would use actually the word yet in our reporting system So they are not yet meeting expectations of grade level. They are not yet working at grade level, because we just really want to be mindful that we cannot decide what our kids are going to learn or what they're capable of learning. So we've got our children here who are just not at that point yet. And so what are we doing? I mean, they're in our classroom. We have these inclusive classrooms. They're sitting at the carpet. They're, socializing. They're doing art, music, all of those things that I said before. But when it comes to curriculum, that is really the key, as I mentioned earlier, to inclusion. When you can include the student in the curriculum, that's when that student is going to be fully included in your classroom, because then they're experiencing the same learning experiences that the other kids are having. And it just creates a tighter bond. It provides a richer environment for them. And there's also lots of research, and the research you can see, I think I have links to it on my website, on how the value of general education curriculum and what it does for students with and without intellectual disabilities, and the positive outcomes it has for students with intellectual disabilities. So now, what kind of got me started on this, I just talked about that, is a couple of years ago, a mom came to me, and because I was just sort of used to making modifications on my own in my classroom, and when you're working in an inclusive system, it's just kind of what you do. You just kind of have this knowledge that you gain over time, either through your special education teacher or your support teacher, or just in little tips and tricks. And there really isn't sort of a repository of ways to modify curriculum. And I wasn't thinking too much about it at the time. I was thinking more about inclusion in general. But I had a mom come to me and she said, my son is in grade 3. He loves being in the classroom. The teacher's awesome. The teacher does everything with him as much as possible. He really, he participates in certain subjects, but he really wants to take the class spelling test. And he's in a grade 3 class, and he's probably working at about a grade 1 level at this point. And she said, what can we do to have Jesse participate in the class spelling list? And so we kind of brainstormed for a while and thought about what he could do. And he could recognize the letters of the alphabet. He knew his sounds. He could sound out small words. He could recognize small words. So I said to her, well, why don't we take the class spelling list, break it down, and find a smaller word in it that Jesse could learn. And then that way, he still has exposure to the class spelling list, so the complete words, but he's learning at his developmental level. He's learning a word inside the larger word that is more at his developmental level, and he's participating, and he can take the test. And so we said, yeah, let's give it a try. So, for example, in this particular test, the students were learning words such as servant. Well, we took out the word ant, A-N-T, and we had Jesse learn how to spell the word ant. So when the teacher said the spelling list, she was able to say the spelling list for the kids who were working at that level, and then the word that Jesse was working at. So he was still involved in what was going on. And it was so successful for him. He loved it. He built confidence. He did very well. He enjoyed it. He looked forward to his spelling tests every week. I mean, who does that? I think most grade 3 kids are pretty still keen on spelling tests, but certainly later on down the road, they're not. So that really got me thinking about modifications and sharing what I know about modifications with others, and some of the strategies that you can use. So just to recap modifications and their specific differences to what an accommodation is. Modifications are for students who have a limited understanding of the content. They're not learning it yet, and they make curriculum achievable. So for example, with Jesse, we took the grade 3 level, grade 3 curriculum, the spelling list words in that curriculum, and we picked out smaller words for him to learn, and we made that spelling list achievable for him, so he was able to learn. So that's what modifications do. So just to recap, they're for students who are not yet working at grade level. They are substitutions, deletions, and additions to the curriculum. So you are changing the curriculum. They fundamentally change the curriculum. So as I mentioned, whatever curriculum you're using, it is going to be changed. And for this reason, making modifications is actually a very formal process. As you know, it involves an individual education plan. It involves a team of education professionals as well as families and, of course, the students, for the most part, to come in and create this plan. That's because modifications can also affect the student's graduation status and what happens down the road. So it's a very formal process. So teachers don't make modifications, you know, on the fly or just because they want to. It's a very purposeful act. It's a very specific and aspect of education that is very, you know, it's very legal. There's documents. I'm sure you've all been at some point or another been involved in an IEP meeting, right? Okay, so and curriculum modifications. Obviously, because the curriculum is being altered, the learning outcomes are changing. So the learning outcomes are being suited to the student who is learning. Now, I always say this because this is a common question that I get. Well, they're not working at that grade level. How can they be in that classroom? You know, how they're not going to be able to learn the material in the classroom or the curriculum. Well, when you include a student who has disabilities, you're not expecting them to work at the same level as the other kids. You're expecting them to work at their level. You're expecting them to not keep up, but to keep learning. And that's the real key to curriculum modifications, is you're giving them material that they can keep learning and achieve. And then, of course, because all of these changes that are happening within the curriculum, the grading and the credit is different. And there's a great resource that I have in my inclusion binder. It's under grading and credit, and it comes out of a fellow from Kansas. And he did a lot of research on how to grade students who are on modified programs and how to give them credit. And lots of really great ways to do that. So, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, modifications are always recorded in the student's IEP. And one last thing too about curriculum modifications, they are ultimately the responsibility of the classroom teacher. Special education teachers are, I'm not trying to put them out of a job, because they have specialized knowledge that classroom teachers do not have, but they are busy people. If you wait for a special education teacher to come around and help you modify a lesson, you're going to maybe have one lesson a month if you're lucky. So classroom teachers really need to take ownership over classroom modifications, and they need to learn how to do them themselves. And then share that with the paraeducator, because sometimes the paraeducator can get involved as well. But it's really ultimately the responsibility of the classroom teacher. The classroom teacher is responsible for teaching curriculum to all of her students, including those who have IEPs. So that's my real kind of big thing these days, is that we really need to get general education teachers on board with this knowledge so that they know how to do it. I do have a quick video, but I'll just quickly show it. I was supposed to have sound. I don't think it does. But this is another example of how we modify, or how work was modified for a student who is in a grade 7 class. His Down syndrome. He is in a math class. His class is learning algebra. And so I don't know if you can see the screen properly or not, but this is how his work has been modified for him. And I'll just quickly show you a brief clip of what he's doing. There is sound. It's kind of funny. He's laughing along with it. But you can see that the teacher has just really broken down some of those algebraic concepts, and he's able to work on that. So you can see that he's got the numbers at the top that he can fill in for X and Y. And then he goes off camera and uses a calculator to solve it. because, you know, why not? We all use calculators. So, so he's working through and completing an activity that's in line with what the rest of the class is doing. So,
Oh boy.
modifications can work at upper grade levels, folks. They happen. So, how do we modify? That's what we're here for. So, modifications are always based on the student's IEP goals. So, when you're planning a modification, you really need to have a really good understanding of what the student's IEP goals are. And of course, there's all the other extra hidden goals and learning outcomes that we want our students to have, but we use this as a guideline. We want to take those goals and incorporate them as much as possible into the curriculum that we're already teaching the rest of the class. We want to keep the standards aligned as much as possible. And so what we do is we use the Common Core curriculum, or whatever curriculum it is, because different states have different curriculums. We have a look at that learning outcome, and we see if a student's IEP goal can fit into that learning outcome, and to what extent. So here's a quick example. Now, California, I don't know if they've got anything specific like this. You probably know more than I do, because I do spend a lot of time talking to other states. And I know, for example, like this is Wisconsin, and
we do.
Yeah, okay. So, and it's laid out where you've got the...
Yes, there's the grade level standard, there's a Common Core connector, which is kind of a mid-level. Yes. Yes, there's on the CASP website, so our state testing website, there are what are called the Common Core connectors.
Okay.
And so it does list the grade level standard, and then there's a Common Core connector, which is kind of midway, not as rigorous as a standard, but a bridge. And then there's an essential understanding, which is the easiest way for the students to access the curriculum.
Perfect, yeah. And most states have their version of that. So this one, I think, was called the essential elements. So it's basically, like you said, the standard, and then it's been broken down into a simpler or a less complex concept for your student. So for example, on the left, the grade level standard is ask and answer questions about key details in text. Well, the broken down kind of larger concept would be identify details in familiar stories. So it's something that is likely more achievable for that student. And after we have a look at the goal that we're going to use and what we're going to, incorporate into our work, we're then going to determine how we're going to deliver that lesson. So how are we going to teach the student that lesson so that they learn that learning outcome? And when we look at the lesson, our goal is to really give the student as much of the same experience as what the others are receiving. So, I mean, very often, or I shouldn't say very often, but there are times when we do have to completely change the material that the student's learning. But in many cases, we can keep the material the same. So there are different ways to look at how we can change the material. We can look at changing content. We can look at changing the conceptual difficulty of the material. We can look at changing the educational goals. And then, of course, the instructional method. And I'm going to go through those and show you how that's done. And this is online as well. So here's an example of something that you might give the classroom. There are the students. Oh, no. Let's go back. And the teacher looks at this and says, okay, I have this student in my class. I really want them to learn about this particular lesson. So I'm going to ask myself, is this too complex for the student? Do I need to break it down? Do I need to change the learning outcomes? Can the student learn what this is set out to teach, or does the student need to be learning different outcomes? Do I need to change the content? Is this content too upper level for the student? Or should I teach it to the student another way? Perhaps the student is not at a level where they're working on worksheets like this. Can I present this information in a different way? So let's look at altering the conceptual difficulty. So when I go to alter the conceptual difficulty, that means I'm going to change how challenging the lesson is. And it means that you can take something such as this. So for example, on the left side, now these are really, really simple examples. You've got a diagram of a dog, and the class is expected to know the parts of the dog, fill them in accurately, and then spell correctly. Okay, this concept was a little bit too large for a particular student in the classroom. So we modified the conceptual difficulty of the lesson, so we broke it down and made it simpler by providing all of the words in the appropriate spaces except for one. So the student was to just cross off which words were used and then fill in the remaining one. So we wanted them to learn one thing on that piece of paper, and that's where the dog's leg was. So that's a really, really watered down version of how to change the conceptual lesson. And there are other strategies to break down concepts that you can use. Those strategies you can find online. I've got a book full of them. And on my website, there's many ways to break down a concept for kids. Now, the second thing that we can do, as I mentioned earlier, in addition to changing the concept, is we can change the educational goals of the lesson. So that means that we're changing the learning outcomes of the lesson. So, for example, I give my kids, my grade 5, or my, not grade 5, but say my grade 2 class, this multiplication assignment, single digit multiplication. And I have a student in my class who's not learning multiplication yet, who's not learning addition yet, but is working on learning how to recognize numbers. So rather than having the student do the multiplication work, we had the student identify the numbers 3 and 4 on the paper. Okay, and remember that this would have been a goal that of the students, is to work on recognizing and learning numbers. Is everyone following me? Any questions so far? Okay. Altering content. So when we go to say we have to alter the content of a lesson, that means that we're going to take a look at the lesson and we're going to change the topic of it or find something that's more meaningful for that student. For example, if the class is learning about westward expansion, well, maybe the student is going to learn about one specific aspect of agriculture or about an animal like a horse or a cow. So it's taking the overall theme and finding something really specific inside it that is meaningful to the student and that is achievable for the student. So in this situation, the class was learning about cell biology. It was a upper middle school class. They were learning about cell biology. And rather than having the student learn the cell biology, the teacher had the student grow plants and then chart, measure and watch and take pictures of the plant growth. So it's still under the same umbrella, but yet more so at the student's level. Instructional method. How can we change the instructional method? Let's say we have to, so for example, the child is not at the level of, or the ability level to do a worksheet. A worksheet is just not possible. So we have opportunities to take that learning off the page for the student. If you've heard that term, you take learning off the page and you provide them with different ways of learning that same material. So here's something that a mom did actually. Oh no, this was a high school teacher. I'll show you something else later. She was teaching her class Romeo and Juliet, something that we might not think of when we have a student with intellectual disabilities. But she had the student read a modified version of Romeo and Juliet, which she found online. There's a great website, and I usually find it by Googling Sherlock Center, so as in Sherlock Holmes, but I do Sherlock Center, and underneath it will be this resource of adapted and modified books that have been simplified. And the other really great resource that I use for this is called Lit Charts. Has anybody heard of Lit Charts before? Amazing. It takes all of the high school level, any of the classics, and just really breaks it down into really more manageable and understandable concepts for kids who need that. So in this situation, the teacher is teaching Romeo and Juliet, and she has her student who's working on a modified program, fill in this picture and then write a sentence about the picture. So again, still working under the theme of Romeo and Juliet, but working on material that's more at his or her level. And then this is one that a parent did when the class was working on cell walls. She actually, major credit to this mom. I would love for her to volunteer in my class and do these. But she had the diagram of the cell, and then I don't know if you can see it or not, but she created the little, identifiers, and they had Velcro on the back of them, and so the student just took the label and put it where it belonged on the bigger sheet there. So she was able to name all the different aspects of the plant cell. So, and that's an example of changing the instructional method. So there's four major ways in which you can modify curriculum. You can change the concept, you can change the content, the instructional method, and the goals of the lesson. And just kind of separate, sometimes you have to do a bunch of those things at once. It's hard to look at one lesson and say, I'm just going to change the concept. Sometimes you have to use 2 or 3 or 4 of these different ways of changing material in order to appropriately modify it for your students. Now, I want to get into some specific examples before we wrap up here and then have time for questions. Here's some examples of modified lessons, because I think it's just really easier in a lot of ways just to see what it looks like, as opposed to me just continuing to talk about ways to do it. So I'll run through quickly, or I'll run through these examples, and you can see how this work was modified and the strategies that were used to modify the work, because that's really, like I said, the key thing. I mean, we're so busy in our day planning and trying to make sure that everything happens. Sometimes we just need that little spark of creativity. And, attending sessions like this and finding out the resources that you can use to make these changes, it's valuable because it kind of gives you new ideas and different ways of doing things. So I think you'll find some of those strategies in here that you can use in your classrooms to start modifying. So this one here is a skeleton. The class was learning about the human body, and this particular student was asked to label certain parts of the body, and so we had them use a website called Sporcle, S-P-O-R-C-L-E, and we made up a modified version where we color-coded the label to the part of the body. So the student had to move the label to the part of the body, so pelvis is green, and then the pelvis part of the body is green. And then the student had to learn the word pelvis. And in that way, they were able to learn the name of the body. And of course, we didn't have them learn all the parts of the body of the human skeleton. We just gave them 4 or 5. This one, I'm not sure. It's a little bit harder to see. But this is your typical reading response worksheet, where you read a chapter and answer comprehension questions. Obviously, the student in this class was not working at that level yet. So we just picked out vocabulary words from that chapter and had the student learn appropriate level vocabulary words. And so this student matched them in this activity. And you can do that by either pre-cutting them and having the student match them or do it online. I mean, there's so many different ways of doing that these days. In this particular one, we had a student who was, the class was learning how to subtract numbers and triple digit numbers. This one doesn't have carrying. So the class was working on this. The student was not working on this level yet of subtraction, so we just crossed out the first 2 columns and had them work on a single column subtraction question. So, using the same worksheet but simplifying the concept. So it's just a very simple cross-out activity. And kids are there's some kids who are comfortable with having different work presented to them or given to them in the classroom. Other kids really want the same work, the exact same paper that everyone else is getting. So it's really dependent, on the child and what they're wanting and how that makes them feel as to what kind of lesson you give them or what type of work you give them. So these are examples of lessons that you can use the same, you can use with the same sheet for both groups of kids. And in this one here, this was the spelling one that I talked about earlier with Jessie and the spelling list. You can see that we took the larger word, found a smaller word inside it, and he worked on the smaller words inside the larger one. And he just filled them in. This one here, so the class obviously is learning about shapes. Our student was not working at that level yet, so we used an app called SnapType. Have you heard of that one? Get it if you haven't. I don't know if there might be a little subscription in there, a little subscription fee. But basically you take a photo of the worksheet or whatever it is that you're working on, and you upload it to this app, and you can type right over the instructions. Or you can blank out an instruction. You can alter the sheet on the go. And then you can just hit print, and then it'll print it off to your nearest printer, or even send it to the nearest device. So it's called SnapType. And so this one we just had the student, do really simple, follow really simple instructions. Find the circle, find the star, find the smallest square, as opposed to these more complex statements on the other sheet. In this one, we, again, has content that was above the learning level of the student. So we took that concept off the page and we gave them something to do that was within the same ream but not necessarily the same activity, and they just worked on drawing a person on the iPad as opposed to learning about parts of the brain. So, again, keeping in line with the theme. Here's another example of ways to sort of have students learn, but not necessarily the same thing. This one, the class was learning about different shapes and faces, edges, and vertices. Well, we just had our student collect different shapes and bring them into the class. And then they were able to point out the different aspects of each shape. So, now I do have a template here. This is kind of how I went about planning for my modifications when I was teaching. And this template is online in my inclusion binder. But it's pretty simple. It's just your standard lesson plan. But I had a column for, what I was teaching my class. And then I had a column for the modified program, so that I could match up as much as I could for the student who was on the modified program. So, it forced me, it made me think about modifying every time I went to do a lesson. It made me think about that student. And this you can find online as well. The book which I mentioned is over there, and it has 40 of these strategies that you can use to modify the curriculum that you have if you need it. It's available on Amazon, and they might be selling it downstairs, but that's just a little plug. And some resources for you, more resources to help you. There's a website called Educate, and she takes mostly high school concepts and creates modified coursework. So this one is for level 1 geography, world geography. And she's done, I think she's done some Shakespeare, and I think she's working on some ancient civilization stuff right now. So if you check out her website, she's got some great modified resources. And then the other one here is that Sherlock Center one that I mentioned about the modified books that have been simplified. So this is a bad case of the stripes, and then it's just broken down into a more simplified version with pick symbols. And then Austin and Lily is a really great website. Sorry, I'm stepping on tape. She also creates full-on unit plans and modified lessons on her website. She has some for free, some to pay for, but she has a wide variety of lessons and concepts and ideas that she has put together for learning materials and are available online. So she's a really great resource. And then lessonpicks.com. It's kind of like the pick symbols, but basically symbols, they have everything. You name it, it's in there. And if they don't have it, you just have to write to them and they'll create the symbol for it. So, and you just print it off and there it is. They're great. And then of course, this one, a few people know this lady or knew this lady. I don't know her yet, haven't met her yet, would love to. She's my idol. Glenda's Assistive Technology. I believe she lives in this area. She has a blog called atclassroom.blogspot.com, and she provides tons and tons of examples of assistive technology and ways to use it. So she lists all the latest and greatest stuff out there to help you modify work or to help you create modified programs. And then of course there's my website, theinclusiveclass.com, and this is that inclusion live binder I was telling you about up here, and you can see like it's broken down into different aspects of inclusion and modification. And actually if you I don't know if I have a link to it, but I actually do have a binder that specifically has modified lessons in it already made. So I will put a link to it in there if it's not already there. I haven't checked yet. But there's actually a binder and it has 30, 40 different modified lessons that you can just look at and use with your class. And just to wrap up and kind of wrap up our day here, why are we doing curriculum modifications? And I've said this over and over again. They're absolutely critical if we want our students with disabilities to achieve and to learn, to experience school the way that it's meant to be experienced, to be included, and to make progress in the general education curriculum. Because if we're not including our students with disabilities, then we are all at risk for limiting not just the students' potential, but our potential as well, because we learn from one another. So, on that note, thank you for listening at the end of the day, and I appreciate your attention. If you have any questions, you can email me at nicoleeredics.com or theinclusiveclass@gmail.com. I'm always responsive on email. I'm also on Twitter. You can tweet, Facebook page at The Inclusive Class, my blog. I'm out there, so feel free to get a hold of me and ask questions if you need to. Thank you very much.